Good morning, everyone. Shalom. It's a great honor to be here today. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, especially the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and also Ben-Gurion University. Okay. So you don't like it if I walk around. Okay. It's going to be a little problematic because my lecture style, I tend to pace up and down in front of the podium, but I'll try to stay put here for the camera's sake. Today, when I first received the invitation, the immediate thing I thought to myself is, yes, I want to come here because it's a region in the world that I have never really seen. And right immediately when I replied to Hilla, I said, yes, I would love to come. The second impression that I had, and I paused myself, is what exactly am I going to say to this audience that would be of interest? Okay? So that's what I've been struggling with since the invitation came. And I realized this is actually not the title that I have wanted my presentation to be, but I stuck with this because I feel that I should try to say something about it to be able to pave more of a foundation for our discussion today, because I think you are addressing a lot of very interesting, very foundational issues that I think are very important, not just for us, but also for the future, in my opinion. Okay, so the question I am going to try to address today is globalization, internationalization, and notice the term could be used either way. I will come back to this a bit later in my presentation. Of higher education, how does this serve the Europe of knowledge? Okay, my immediate impression is, wow, as an academic, there is a lot of concepts in there. How do I even begin unraveling most of them to even answer meaningfully in a way this question? So here on the screen, you will see that I have highlighted essentially the title. You have the notion of the globalization of higher education, the internationalization of higher education, and the Europe of knowledge. And is this serving the Europe of knowledge? Is this serving the Europe of knowledge? So for me, personally, I think in order to answer this question, we need to discuss what is the Europe of knowledge. And I'm actually happy I'm the only person, hopefully, will be talking extensively about this. And also, does the Europe of knowledge have clear aims? And lastly, are these aims linking up with what is happening elsewhere in the world? I think in order to even discuss these questions, we need to know what are the bases we're talking about. So let me bring you to Europe. So the focus of my presentation today will be on the Europe of knowledge, but as I will come to later on in my discussion, there's two pillars. There's the European research area, as Moshe reminded us earlier, that Israel is doing very well. And there's the European higher education area, in which will be the focus of my talk today. And it's actually something I don't do research in. So most of what I will talk about today, I will be honest, as an academic, I will highlight the contributions from my colleagues, because I think they will add more to what I can say. Okay, the approach that I adopt in my presentation is mainly as a political scientist, because I've learned a long time ago, I should at least try not to pretend that I could talk about something I don't know. So I will approach it from a political science perspective. But I think on a more serious point, I think political science has a lot to offer, especially to understanding the nature and effects of the European higher education area. Because the Bologna process, the EHEA, is a fascinating case. It is European, but not strictly EU. The adopted measures are non-binding, but is extremely powerful. As a case in point, we are here today to talk about something that, as far as I understand, Israel is not a member of. Okay. And the emergence of the EHEA is a very unexpected development. It was a surprise for a lot of people who, look at it retrospectively. And also, the rapid institutionalization of this process is surprising. Okay, so political science, what do? We tell you the how and the why, and hopefully our contributions will let you discuss to what effects, what are the impact, and I'm sure Anne will pick up on this in just a little bit. Okay, my presentation today, I structured into 4. We'll have some history, because I think history is always important. And I hope I will not bore you too much in the sense that you know a lot of this history. And also, I would like to talk about the position of the EHEA in the whole Europe of Knowledge project. And then we come to the nature of the EHEA and the effects. Okay, without further ado, the EHEA in 2014, today, we now take it for granted. As academics and also practitioners, this thing exists, it's there. But this is not always the case. In fact, about a decade and a half ago, the idea to harmonize, to standardize, standardize from a political science perspective is two very different terms. Harmonize essentially means you bring everything to almost the same exact way of application, where standardize, you could have some differences and nuances in national practices. This, in the higher education sector, was completely out of the question. And also what we call the crystallization of the EHA was unexpected. I highly recommend for those who are interested in Anne Corbet's book. She details an extreme careful case study. And Anne is currently updating this book. It will come out in 2015. She will bring the discussion up to 2015 with an eye towards the future for those who are interested in this. So, as an academic, you will know the number 3 is a very good number to go with. So, I will divide the history of EHEA in 3 phases. Now, first, before the mid-1970s, we know that cooperation in the field of higher education mainly took place in the Council of Europe, not EU. Why is that? Where is the EU? Because when we think about the Europe of Knowledge, isn't this a European project? Isn't this the European process? The standard argument in the literature, and I think this bears out a lot in practice even today, is that, well, frankly, higher education is something that is so to the core of national identity, sovereignty. And you know what? The EU and the institutions, they have no business doing any sort of regulation in this area. This is a standard line, and I think it is true. So in the EU, we have this principle called the principle of subsidiarity, which the treaties today still uphold. And I think we need to bear this in mind as we have this discussion. The Europe of Knowledge, it's not overbearing. It's still a project, a work in progress. And also, higher education development is not a recent development. It sounds slightly contradicting, but we have always been thinking about these issues. As early as the beginning of the European integration process, there have been talks about establishing a European university. And again, I refer you to Anne's book. So, in the second phase, 1970s, 1990s, we're coming forward now. We have this emergence of a European EU dimension. Okay? Why is that the case? How is it possible that Europe suddenly became rather prominent? Well, if we look at some of the key decisions that were adopted during this period, there's been 2 council resolutions on EU higher education, and also what we know now, the Erasmus program was adopted towards the late 1980s. But it is not about higher education. So this, I think, for those who are interested in European integration, a lot of these developments came about not because of that particular policy sector, it's because the European member states wanted to implement free movement, persons, capital, services, and goods. But now we know we have the 5th freedom, free movement of knowledge. Okay, so during this period, if you're interested in these developments, it actually came about because the Court of Justice, in other fields as well, in migration, which I know more about, they adopted these major rulings about, well, we really want to implement free movement. How do we do it? We need to, well, we should have some principle of non-discrimination in place. And we also need to have some sort of basic recognition qualifications. And what I found was interesting is through the Gravier ruling in the 1980s, there was a definition of vocational training. So vocational training, as defined by the court, is that it refers to skills, qualification. So it's something that, it relates to higher education, but is not exactly overlapping, but it's there. So through this, we have a gradual institutionalization process. Now, we come to the Bologna era. And here, I refer to my good colleague, Pauline Rabinet's work. She's a French political scientist, but very strong understanding of sociology. She does a lot of in-depth work on Bologna, if you're interested and you read French. She argues that the Bologna process was essentially a catalyst in this whole process. Because, put simply, before Bologna, the European higher education policy was just a collection of initiatives. After Bologna, we have this talk about coordinated process of policy exchange with common aims. And, as an article, I'm sure the slides will be made available afterwards for you if you're interested. I just want to highlight this. When we're talking about European higher education policy, what are we talking about? These are the 10 action lines. I will not read them. But as you can see, they're very straightforward. To develop comparable degrees, to have a credit transfer system, to essentially the idea is to promote mobility. For our PhD students out there, if you are interested in understanding this process, you can also look at it through a historical lens. As the bottom ones are the ones that are adopted more recently, you have this talk towards bringing more synergy between the European research area and the European higher education area. So, in my opinion, there's a gradual process trying to create this Europe of knowledge instead of two different pillars. So, this is actually my very childish illustration of what I think building the Europe of knowledge, if we see it as a house. Okay? As you can see, we have two pillars in there, the European research area. I also highlighted Innovation Union. In European discourse, a lot of these terms are used interchangeably for competitiveness, to be innovative, to be one of the best. So, I highlighted, take this literally. The size of the pillar means the greater the amount of activity that could fall under European competence. And the story that I just described, the EHEA pillar in orange, it's a gradual movement. This pillar was institutionalized outside of the EU framework. There's been a gradual movement into upholding the rooftop that is the Europe of knowledge. But as you can see, it is a pillar that's not entirely into the house. So this begs the question, I think I would like to come back later. Is this project, is the roof, is this sustainable? Will it fall if some part of the pillar tilts one or the other way? I want to highlight this, and I think this cannot be overemphasized. When we talk about knowledge policies, we are talking about a lot of things, including research, innovation, science, education, and training. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. This makes the whole governance structure for the Europe knowledge very messy, very complex, because the sectors that are involved in this process are organized very differently. People working in research don't necessarily think the same way as people working in education. And I think we can find commonalities in academia, just even among social scientists and humanities. We just don't think the same. And the challenge is that it involves many hands. So imagine we don't talk to each other, we think differently, and we're about to come together to make this project work. So, what are the challenges? Also, I believe that the Europe of knowledge is not anchored in one particular sector. And if we follow the official discourse to how the different policy area talks about this project, it seems like it's still up for grabs. There's still this belief that if we just find the right policy phrase to frame this project, we can bring it to our sector. Okay. Essentially, this comes to 4 visions of Europe of knowledge. Moshe, I know you had 3. I have 4. Okay. Europe of knowledge, one of the visions is that it is seen as the foundation for knowledge-based economy. This is probably the most straightforward. To improve, to sustain, to maintain economic competitiveness. Another vision, probably more in line with higher education, is that it's an embodiment of a knowledge-based society. Civic education and socializing the citizens of Europe now across borders. But it's also, this is what I find interesting in the European debate, as an instrument for knowledge-based policy. As academics, I understand there's a stronger drive that we need to make our research findings relevant for policy problems. So this, we also find resonance. But what's most interesting, I think we can all agree with, is the fourth vision, that this Europe of Knowledge project is used as a tool for enhancing the competitiveness of European science and higher education. So, these four visions, although they overlap, they may not necessarily be compatible. So an open question I also like to put on the table: if Israel were really to adopt a national strategy in higher education and research towards the Europe of knowledge, which vision should we give priority? There's tensions. And how do we decide? And here's a book, a bit of a self-plug, that just came out last month. I edited with my colleague in Norway, Åsa Gorniska, in which we put the broader developments of Europe of knowledge, both higher education and research, we compare them. And I think this is relevant. Where is the whole Europe of knowledge within the context of European integration? And you will find, if you were astutely listening, that I'm repeating the same exact thing through all my slides. One, Europe of knowledge, it actually propelled knowledge policy sectors to the center of European integration. Because now, if we think about innovation union, economic competitiveness, it needs this. Now it's in the center. But the challenge is the path of institutionalization is different in each of the policy sectors. That means, what does that mean? The procedures, instruments, actors involved, they're different. Some of them might overlap because you have actors who go through different constellations in the knowledge sector. Put simply, there's no single governance body to articulate a uniform message about the Europe of knowledge. So we come to Bologna. Same understanding. The Bologna process, as Raka notes, is neither within or without the EU or the Europe process. It has its own vision, has its own governance structure, has its own working culture. It's a bit more informal, it's more intergovernmental. What I found interesting is this: it has a very different geographical boundary, 47 versus 28. And I'll come to 2 slides about the Commission, because I think this is important when we're talking about European integration, the role of the Commission in this process. As far as I understand, the Commission is considered a very important actor because it has more resources in discursive terms, but most importantly, financial terms. It actually funds a lot of these projects. And also organizational resources. It has experiences that I can share. So this led to a lot of studies. There's 2 lines of argument of what the Commission is as an actor in this process. One, if you follow Capano and Piattoni's argument, they argue that there's been a Lisbonization of the Bologna process in which the Commission has taken over the whole development. I think it's a bit more nuanced. I agree with these scholars. It's far more complex. Anne Courbet, in her more recent work, calls it's a ping-pong game, okay, between the different actors, especially the Commission and the national actors, for the leadership of this process. And Muller-Ravinet, they say, well, frankly, I think if we look at these developments, national actors are not passively absorbing all of this. Everybody who is involved are very active. They have their own vision of what it should be. Okay? Therefore, according to them, these national actors adopt an attitude of vigilant cooperation. So what does this mean about nature of the EHEA? And by nature, I mean, what are these underpinning dynamics? Scott says, Bologna in 3 phases. First, Bologna actually refers to very concrete terms, concrete objectives, like I referred to the 10 action lines, but it has recently acquired a broader significance. It extends to ERA and the Lisbon Strategy, or Europe 2020. And lastly, and he uses it, Bologna. It's become a powerful brand. I don't know what's powerful these days, Nike, these international brands, it's become a brand. So other actors, they highlight what is the discursive dimension of Bologna process. They see it as more of a deliberative arena, an agora or social platform, and this should be the takeaway message. The Bologna process is actually, we could see it as a process of socialization, okay? In which higher education, not just policymakers, but also academics, in which we come to understand the Bologna process as a taken for granted thing. So for policymakers, Bologna is a forum for them to meet and exchange, also for them to learn. I think learning is still really important in this process, because as we if we don't cross borders and we don't understand the challenges across our border, we really don't understand what's going on. There may be lessons to be learned. But also, this is very important, to propose acceptable solutions that everyone can agree on. So what does this mean? What are the effects of the EHEA? There's a huge literature on higher education reform. But I want to highlight the main messages as follows. Now, it's impossible for us to consider higher education reform without reference to Bologna. But, and I watched some of the video clips from the conference 2 years ago. I think Johanna de Witte highlighted the same message. But this is also important for us to remember. Bologna did not necessarily lead to policy convergence. We would expect it to be, but it's not. Because Bologna has different meanings for people, has different meanings for everyone. I want to highlight my colleague's work, Martina Vukosovic. She works on the Balkans, and she shows through very detailed case studies that Bologna, it's been renationalized by the actors, in which now they're in a position to think about what their national priorities are. And in this process, we see Bologna being used to perhaps legitimize some national domestic preferences that may or may not lead to whatever policy objectives are. So coming back to this very, very tricky question, I want to answer with a longer quote. Essentially, what in my presentation today, I have told you that European integration in these areas, it did not happen as a steady conceptual process. And it's not a process that is completely locked in. It's work in progress. It is not a process of rational design. I think this we need to keep in mind. It's not necessarily rational. And it is not determined by political will that's been set before. We are involved in this process, and we can still change it towards where we want to take us. And most importantly, I think this is a key message for Israel as well, there's no single coherent group of actors. Nobody is there to control all of these processes. We are all involved in this. So, what does this all mean? This is my last slide. I don't think we should think about the globalization or internationalization of higher education as serving any particular region, any particular country. I think we should think about the variations of regional initiatives, of how it serves our particular regional flavor and what we need, okay? These are very academic questions, I admit. Are there patterns of emergence very similar? Are the processes the same? Are there similar objectives? And do these processes lead to similar outcomes? But lastly, I didn't talk about this, but I think it is a very interesting phenomenon that is worth discussing. What about this thing we call the digital revolution in higher education and research? What role can they play in this process? And I want to thank you for your attention. That's my presentation. Thank you.